L'ordine del giorno.
In line with the agenda, we now have a declaration from the Vice President of the Commission and High Representative on the situation of Christians in the Middle East. Mrs. Mogherini.
Cari colleghi, on Palm Sunday, as you well remember, 2 Coptic churches were attacked in Egypt as worshippers gathered for Mass. 45 people were killed, hundreds were wounded. The terrorists of Daesh have claimed the attack because in their mind there is no room for the peaceful coexistence of different faiths. Now I start from this, just one of the terrible attacks on Christians in the Middle East, to mention the response that this madness provoked. One of the best responses I've ever seen to one of these attacks. Just 1 week later, on Easter Sunday in Jordan, tens of Muslim youths stood guard to protect churches and Christian believers, to make sure that they could celebrate their holiest festivity in peace and in respect. These young people of Muslim faith, these young Jordanians, I believe are Daesh's worst nightmare. They show the real face of the Middle East, and they honour hundreds of years of peaceful coexistence of different religious faiths in the Middle East. And you will remember well the message that His Majesty the King of Jordan delivered in this very same hemicycle, exactly along these lines. When Pope Francis embarked on his historic visit to Egypt last month, he described Christians, Muslims and people of all faiths as fellow travellers. For thousands of years, people of different religions have been fellow travellers in the Middle East, in Europe and in the rest of the world. In a moment when freedom of religion or belief comes under attack in many parts of our world, we have a duty first of all to preserve this diversity, also here in Europe. Religious or ethnic groups, Christians and others, are being forced to flee from lands they have inhabited for centuries. We can and must preserve the space for people of different backgrounds to be fellow travellers, sharing their land and their lives. Christianity was born in the Middle East. It belongs to the Middle East. Yet we know that entire Christian communities have been forced to leave their home countries and the region. The phenomenon is not new, but what is new is the trend that is now more worrying than ever. This is not only causing great human suffering to Christians as well as to many other minorities in the region, but if the Middle East loses its incredible diversity, that is a problem in itself. It would also lose its greatest richness. For this reason, the European Union is engaged on a daily basis to protect all minorities and every person's human rights, with concrete actions in several fields. I'll mention a few of them. First, we systematically raise freedom of religion and belief at different levels of our political dialogues, including in our human rights dialogues with countries in the Middle East. Together with a number of partner countries, we have developed what we call our partnership priorities in order to promote common interests. The protection of human rights is always part of our own priorities. Second field of action, we always condemn violence against religious or belief minorities, with public statements and with private démarches. Public advocacy is not always sufficient, but it reminds to all discriminated groups that they are not alone in the struggle. Third field of action, we work to ensure that freedom of religion and belief remains prominently on the global agenda and specifically on the UN agenda, featuring a strong human rights approach. Fourth field of action, the EU Special Representative, Stavros Lambrinidis, is doing an amazing job and he keeps raising these issues in all his official visits and dialogues, most recently to Egypt, just to mention one country. In May 2016, as a follow-up to the European Parliament's resolution on the systematic mass murder of religious minorities by Daesh, we have appointed Mr. Figels as the first special envoy for the promotion of freedom of religion or belief outside the European Union. Fifth field of action, we are seeking the broadest engagement of relevant regional actors and international organisations. Preserving diversity is first and foremost a Middle Eastern interest. So we will not stop working to protect all minorities, but we are not alone in this task and we look for cooperation with our partners. Sixth, We are providing very concrete financial support to local communities and minorities through the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. The 2016 Global Call for Proposals addressed the rights of persons belonging to minorities, and a new call on freedom of religion or belief will be launched in 2017, aiming at supporting local and international civil society organisations in promoting mutual tolerance and understanding. We are also providing support to Christians in countries where they are facing a precarious situation. In Iraq, for example, we are making sure that our projects for stabilisation also deliver on the needs of Christian communities. Last but certainly not least, we are fighting terrorism through security cooperation with our work to end conflicts in our region and by addressing the social, economic and cultural roots of radicalisation. And in this work, we also have a duty to tell the narrative right, to represent also the best face of the Middle East, the face of diversity, the face of those Muslim young people protecting Christian churches. We must give voice, if I can quote Pope Francis in Italian, non solo alla inciviltà del conflitto.
Not only the lack of civilization in the conflict, but the incivility of the conflict.
Believe that there is no space for living together, neither in the Middle East nor elsewhere. Even in Syria, we were discussing this a few minutes ago, in the middle of the most violent conflict of our times, we hear the stories of Christian and Muslim neighbours helping each other to make it through the war. And the different religious groups and minorities, identities, groups in Syria will have the major responsibility to try and bridge the differences, the hate and the difficulty of restarting living together once the conflict will be over. There is still room for hope. A future of diversity for the Middle East is still possible, and we believe this is a work we can do together with our partners globally and in the region. This is the commitment of our European Union, protecting, protecting, protecting and offering a perspective of diversity and unity. Thank you.
Grazie all'Alto Rappresentante.
Thank you very much to the High Representative. The Presidency's services inform me that we're falling seriously behind the time frame for this debate. We've got another 5 debates after this one, so in this debate blue cards will not be permitted. We'll now hear from the political groups. Mr. Preda will be first for the European People's Party, 1 minute 30.
Grazie Presidente. Donc quand on dit chrétien au Moyen-Orient,
when we say Christian in the Middle East, we think, as the High Representative herself said, we think first of all of the Copts in Egypt, and it's true the situation is worrying. This community was savagely attacked by a series of attacks. Of course, security needs to be strengthened, and the Egyptian authorities are making efforts to achieve this. But I think that we need to see this issue in the wider context of persecution of Christians in the Middle East, and that's why our political party asked for the debate to be given that title rather than just talking about the Copts. The proclamation of the Caliphate by the group known as Daesh or ISIS is part of the war between Shiite and Sunni, but it is also directed against Christians. That is a fact. Daesh systematically targets Christians, and the term genocide has been used quite rightly because that is exactly what this is about. The intent is to destroy the Christian communities, and as the High Representative said, the disappearance of Christians in the Middle East will be a tragedy. It will be the sign of the end of a diverse society, and I think it is important that we prevent this from happening. The EU can act on several fronts, for example, to act against the instrumentalization of religion in these conflicts, and also ensuring that international law is applied in relation to religion and freedom of religion.
Thank you. For the Socialist and Democrat Group, Mr. Lietz, 2 minutes.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident, hohe Beauftragte! President, High Representative, as a Christian, I grew up under a situation where I understood what it means when a political system actually intervenes in people's personal freedoms and forces people to leave the country. I welcome the fact that we are discussing the situation of Christians in the Middle East, and I would like to take this as an opportunity to look and to call for the freedom of all religions in the Middle East and around the world. I'd like to make 3 points. Firstly, freedom of religion is crucial for democratic developments in the Middle East because of the religious plurality in the Middle East. It's crucial that for peaceful coexistence, as you've just mentioned, High Representative, that this should be respected. And I will call on the EU to look at countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and to ask them to respect the rights of people which are being trampled underfoot. In Egypt, the situation of the Coptic Christians is at risk as well. These examples, I think, are in contrast to Tunisia. The newly elected government spoke in favour of religious tolerance, and thereby Tunisia deserves support from the EU. Secondly, interreligious dialogue and education have to be strengthened. An important aspect of international support was mentioned by Pope Francis during his visit to Egypt. He stressed that religious education has to be strengthened, interreligious dialogue has been forwarded and has to be used to help create peace. The EU, I think, can commit more on that front. Thirdly, the rights to religion are universal and must be respected. Article 8 talks about this universality of freedom to religion, and there is broad consensus here in this House. Mr. Wieland and another range of MEPs have called for the freedom to practice religion. This resolution was signed up to by 28 ministers, or rather members of the parliament from 28 countries. And then a last example is the latest Sakharov Prize. The European Parliament chose 2 representatives of the Yazidi minority and clearly provided support for them through the prize.
If you don't turn your microphone on, we won't be able to hear you.
Adesso sì.
Adesso era acceso, era già acceso. Mr. President, Madam High Representative, I have a long association with the Coptic Christians of Egypt through its large diaspora community living in London. The attacks of last month against 2 Christian churches in Egypt were the latest in a series of atrocities. These remind us not only of the continued security risk that Egypt faces from Al-Qaeda, particularly in the Sinai, but also of the wider plight that Christians as communities face across the entire Middle East. There are around 30 million Christians living in the region, the largest numbers based in Egypt, Lebanon and Syria. The Syrian civil war has tragically seen tens of thousands of Christians displaced, fleeing for their lives as ISIS has deliberately targeted them both there and in neighbouring Iraq, where on a visit 2 years ago I met a number of Assyrian Christian IDPs, and I would like to take this opportunity to praise the efforts of the KRG in providing shelter for Christian refugees housed within its territory. Whilst I, of course, also welcome support from EU member states that have been given an offer to Christian refugees from the Middle East, I believe that it's important that we recognise that such expulsions of Christians is precisely the aim of groups like ISIS, who wish to see a Middle East free of all non-Sunni Muslim religious minorities. Our efforts should concentrate, therefore, on establishing safe haven autonomous regions within the Middle East, such as in the Nineveh Plains in Iraq, and supporting communities to rebuild their lives and defend themselves in the places that their civilization has been rooted for over 2 millennia. With some 5 million refugees and IDPs uprooted from their homes due to the conflicts in Iraq and Syria, it's easy for the plight of the Middle East Christians to be forgotten. Thank you.
Mrs.
Vautmans, 2 minutes for you on behalf of the ALDE Group.
Thank you, President. Madam Mogherini, I would like to thank you for your message of hope. which is a very difficult debate that we have to have yet again today, you are expressing a message of hope directed not just to Christians but all religious communities who are the victims of violence, discrimination and killing. And I think the points that you make, that we have to continue to insist on freedom of religion, that as Europe we need to stand up for respect of human rights throughout the world, that we in the European Union need to keep doing this and insisting on it. I agree with that, and I agree with the points that you summed up. And something else I'd like to emphasize is that we have to ensure that those who are responsible are punished. As long as there is impunity, then discrimination and violence will continue to be useful to some. So I think that Europe really has to send a signal that there needs to be real respect for human rights and that these criminals and assassins will be held accountable. Now, Mrs. Mogherini, you know that we as liberals attach great importance to freedom and stability in the region. I don't know how often we've had this debate with you about the Middle East and Israel and Palestine. And at this session in Strasbourg, we're going to be voting on an important resolution on Thursday. We will be negotiating on this tomorrow morning. It's a resolution which calls once again for a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. I think if we can make steps in that direction, then violence will decrease there and peace will come about, which will mean that the religious communities can live side by side in peace. So you have our support to continue sending out this message of hope and human rights in the world.
Mr. KOHLÍČEK, 1 minute, on behalf of the GUI group.
Grazie. In eastern part of Maghreb and Mashrek, the situation of all minorities, no matter whether religious or of ethnic, has been very complicated in recent years. Most of those areas have been inhabited for 8,000 years, and always the local population suffered from war conflicts. In spite of that, dozens of ethnic and religious minorities have cohabited here in symbiosis for centuries. In recent years, with the rise of radical Islam, the situation has significantly deteriorated. Everybody who is not in line with the ideas of, for instance, Islamic State may be killed, tortured, raped or enslaved. Often there are forced conversions, and the biggest community at threat are Coptic Christians. In some parts of the Egypt, the traditionally rebellious nomadic tribes are implementing the above ideas, and this situation might destabilize the economy of the country and also threaten other Islamic minorities. We should support the Egyptian...
Thank you very much. For the Greens group, Mrs. Valero, 1 minute 30. Thank you very much. Well, as it's already been said, the conflict and discrimination has driven hundreds of thousands of Christians and other religious minorities to leave their home country and head for the EU. Now, about 3 to 4% of the region's population are Christian. That's a reduction from 20% 100 years ago. 120,000 people in Sweden come from the Assyrian Christian groups from Turkey and Syria. Many arrived in the 1970s and more arriving today. But as their presence grows in Europe, their continued presence in the Middle East is threatened. One day the conflict in Syria will come to an end, and we need to support rebuilding when that happens and allow these people to return home. All religious and ethnic minorities should have the right and the possibility to live in their historic and traditional home countries in dignity, equality and safety. They need to be able to use their political and human rights. Mrs. Mogherini has already reported on all the things we're doing. That's a good thing, but I think that we can also be important in bringing forward political dialogue. there are a lot of different political and ethnic and religious groups who live in the region, and it's very important that we be supporting their role in the debate on the rebuilding of their countries. On behalf of the EFDD group, Mr. Parker for 2 minutes.
President, High Representative, this is not the first time that I've stood in this chamber to draw attention to the terrible suffering of Christian communities throughout the Middle East. It would appear that far from major moves to alleviate that suffering, it is doomed to continue. Only this Easter, speculation increased over whether or not Christianity had a future in the Middle East. These are ancient communities existing since the earliest foundations of the faith, and it is a daunting prospect that we let ancient communities wither in the face of the growing radical Islamism throughout the region. Whilst the bombings of the Coptic Church in Egypt by Islamic State were a tragedy, the support by the Egyptian government is a model that should be emulated throughout the region. The attack was not just as one on a community, but on all Egyptians. We must continue to draw attention to the situation of Christians and make sure that more is done to prevent the destruction of these ancient communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Obermayr, you have the floor on behalf of the ENF group. 1 minute. 2 minutes, rather.
Grazie, Presidente. Ich bin sehr froh, dass ihr...
I'm very happy that we have this opportunity to talk about the very serious situation of Christians in the Middle East. And the reason for requesting this we put on the agenda were the terrible attacks on the Coptic churches at Easter. But we have to ask the question of why in the 21st century the Christians are still subject to this terrible persecution in the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not just IS or Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, which are being supported, of course, by Saudi Arabia, who are responsible for this. We see that an increasingly fanatic Islam is also contributing to this. You can see this with organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, because Sharia doesn't tolerate a Christian minority, and certainly not for them to practice their faith. The European Parliament and the European Parliament hasn't condemned INORB and FEMISO, organizations related to the Muslim Brotherhood. They have give money to a youth organization connected to these, and also there was 50,000 euros given to a Sharia project in Ireland. And in the Libe committee, one of their ex-presidents was invited to talk about Islamophobia. And on his Facebook page, he was boasting about his contacts to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. I wonder what the Assyrians and the Copts who are subject to persecution think about this. They would really wonder whether the West is in its right mind. They feel they've been abandoned by the West. They need our financial and material support. I think we need to take action urgently, because the situation really is very serious.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Gollnisch.
Libérer, protéger.
Free, protect and reconstruct. Those three principles should be the basis of what we're looking at today. To liberate from the cancer which is threatening directly. We can't do everything, but we could call finally to have freedom of religion and get rid of the crime of blasphemy in the Muslim countries which we have diplomatic relations, and then delete the reference to religion on ID cards. We have to protect also the peoples in the Middle and Near East. We know we may well be the next victims, and we should send international observers. We have to reconstruct, because these people, these communities, should be encouraged not to leave their own countries and come to us, but rather should be happy to stay where they are or go back, rather than being forced to leave those places in the first place.
Mr. Salafranca, 1.5 minutes, please. Micro.
Thank you, Madam President, High Representative, Members of Parliament. Millions of people are persecuted because of their religious faith as Christians around the world. In 2016, last year, that was a terrible year, 90,000 Christians died. It's clear that with the program of Islamic State, the Caliphate, this is something which has become much more visible. And the pictures of 21 Christian Copts on the beaches of Libya in 2015 went global. In December 2016, there was another attack in Cairo with 26 people dead and more than 40-odd were injured. The High Representative recalled the attacks on Palm Sunday. There has been a dramatic drop in the presence of Christians in the region. In 2013, in Iraq, there were 1 million Christians. There are only now 300,000. And in the whole of the Middle East, as we've heard from some of the previous speakers, the population of Christians is less than 2.9%, down from about 9%. So given that situation, we have to react. We have, as the High Representative was saying, to keep this way up at the top of our agenda. We have to mobilize all of the resources. The High Representative said how many there are to try and guarantee minority rights there. We also, I believe, have to support projects such as the university which has been set up, bringing in all the religious confessions, which brings in all of the refugees from Mosul. Thank you.
Colleagues, I'm being unnecessarily strict because we are 20 minutes over our time, so apologies for interrupting an important point. So I would ask to stick to your speaking time. 1.5 minutes now for Mr. Assis.
President, High Representative, the existence of Christian communities in the Middle East goes back to the very beginning of Christianity. In fact, it were these first communities that first linked Christianity with classical philosophy. 100 years ago, they were 20% of the region's population. Now we're down to about 3 to 4%. Especially over the last few years, Christians have been victims to discrimination or attacks that have led to exile or even death. These situations are not exclusive, and it's not limited to the Christian faith. Muslim minority groups are also victims of Islamic violence. But this violence dehumanizes and ends up killing people. The Christian communities are subject to pressure and discriminations that are absolutely unacceptable, that are aimed at converting them to Muslim. Women are being raped and attacked and forced to submit to Islam. So I'll remind you of various terrorist attacks in Egypt. One attack in a church, one outside of a Catholic church, 45 deaths and many injured. The conflict between Sunnites and Shiites have led to a terrible situation, and the collapse of state structures in Iraq have also endangered religious minorities. Europe needs to be entirely committed to providing full support to these Christian communities that are so violently persecuted. Thank you. 2 minutes, Mr. Legutko.
Thank you. As we just heard, 15 years ago there was about 2.3, 2.5 million Christians in Iraq. Today there are about 200,000. In Lebanon, we have 1 million Christian refugees from Syria. This is an official number. The unofficial number is twice as many. 2/3 of Christians have left Syria. Are they safe in Lebanon? Hardly. Their future is uncertain, to say the least. All in all, last year, and we had that also today, about 80 or 90,000 Christians were murdered all over the world. The number dropped by half in comparison with the previous years. A success? I wouldn't say so. All these numbers are terrifying. So why is the reaction of the EU and the entire Western world so inadequate? One would think it is the West that should defend the Christians, because Christianity is the vital part of our civilization. Without Christianity, we wouldn't have existed. It is our sacred duty to defend Christians as Christians. If we do not defend them, no one will. So why aren't we? One of the reasons are deep anti-Christian prejudices. In Europe, the Christians have been an object of increasing discrimination. One would hardly expect that this hostility toward European Christians could result in a full-bodied defense of the Christians elsewhere. The fact that this meek reaction of Europe can be explained doesn't make it less shameful.
Thank you. 1 minute now, please, for Madam Becerra.
Thank you, Chair. Mrs. Mogherini. 5 months ago, we awarded the Sakharov Prize to Nadia Murad to draw attention to the religious minority of the Yazidis that has been the subject of the genocidal campaign by Daesh militants. But the senseless and heartless brutality of Daesh continues. The slaughtering of Christians in Egypt, which we are debating today, again disfigures the face of humanity, as Pope Francis correctly warned again this week. Mrs. Mogherini, I thank you for the strong comments you made today. I support you and hope your actions will be successful. The respect for fundamental and human rights is the core value of the European Union. Any violation of these rights affects the democratic principles upon which our society is founded, whether they take place within or outside the EU. All minorities, regardless whether religious, ethnic or sexual, deserve our relentless protection. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam von Storch, 1 minute.
Madam President, I would like to start by thanking the group for having accepted my request, which has meant that we have this issue on today's agenda. This is an important issue. More than 200 million Christians around the world are persecuted because of their Christian faith. Now, a special envoy was appointed last year for religious and belief and their freedoms, and I'm surprised he's not here now. I'm surprised that so many Christian Democrats are not here today as well. The question is, do we want to help Christians? And if we do, how? We cannot accept all refugees from around the world, so we have to choose. So I'm saying, if we have to choose, then let's give the priority to the Christians.
1.5 minutes now for Madame D'ORNANO.
Madam President, Madam High Representative, at the beginning of the 20th century, 1/4 of the inhabitants of the Middle East were Christians. Today, they only make up 3% of the population. So we can't say anymore that we didn't know. Of course, the coalition forces are making progress and are reconquering areas which were under ISIS. At the moment, Daesh only holds 10% of the city of Mosul. But these military successes shouldn't blind us to the reality. Christians in Karakosh celebrated Easter 2017 in their city symbolically, but most of the population of the region does not want to or cannot go back home. I went to Iraq last year, and there Christians have been victims of genocide and are continuing to leave the region. It is our duty to help Christians who are suffering, particularly on the Nineveh plain. We need to help them rebuild their city. The state is more taken up with its ulterior motives in the Shiite conflict rather than in dealing with Christians. It's important that we speak with a united voice and call on people's conscience and act before it is too late.
Thank you. We now move to Mr. Synadinos for 1 minute, please.
The persecution, abuse, murders and violent Islamization of Christians living in the Middle East could be compared with the times of the martyrs during the first years of Christianity. What is going on is literally a religious genocide against the Christians, who are threatening to disappear from the demographic, cultural and religious map of the Holy Lands. Recently, during a visit I made to Malawi in Syria, I witnessed the unimaginable disaster caused by the Islamists in the historic monastery of St. Theclas. Both Christians and monuments alike fell victim to the barbarity of the Islamists.
To slow down a little, the interpreters are requesting. Thank you.
Thank you, President. At the ISIS slave market, a young Christian or Yazidi of between 10 and 20 years old sells for about $150. Aged from 1 to 9 years old, the price is $200. All those fighting for multiculturalism and open borders should be asked, what is the cost of human dignity and faith? No one needs to accuse me of being an intolerant Islamophobe. I prefer not to accept the slaughter, the humiliation of Christians by the Islamists, rather than the political correctness that's being advocated. The Middle East has been drained of Christians. Europe is next in line. Thank you.
And now 1.5 minutes, Madame Alliot-Marie.
Madam High Representative, the European Union has to go beyond fine words on the fate of Christians in the Middle East and beyond the usual talk of human rights. We cannot allow Daesh to redraw the Middle East and eradicate Christian minorities. When Muslims are under attack around the world, Muslim countries react. When Jews are attacked around the world, Israel reacts. Europe has Christian roots, whether that pleases people or not, and it also has to have its voice heard as well. What will Europe say when Christians are forced to leave the lands where they have traditionally lived? Will it allow them to stay there or to return there? The European Union has to put pressure on local authorities when they have their ears open. But it's not just a question of the rights of human beings, but it's a question of tolerance, a balance, the security of the Middle East, and go beyond the Middle East to the entire world. So today we need to act, and act in practice. Madam High Representative, there are means at our disposal. Beyond fine words or initiatives on human rights, what are you actually going to do when it comes to feels like law, diplomacy, coercive or military means to permit people to remain in their homes or to return? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. López, 1.5 minutes.
Presidenta.
Madam President, High Representative, we want to speak out but also stress institutionalized discrimination and persecution of Christian minorities in many parts of the Middle East. But we also want to recall that this is happening in some that we see as our close allies. The Copt minority in Egypt has been complaining that they're not given adequate security, as we saw in these horrendous attacks on churches over the last few months. In various important Gulf countries as well, they are not allowed to exercise their religion, and many Christians today in the Gulf are migrant workers and particularly vulnerable. So we have to use all of the tools available to us, diplomatic ones too, to protect these communities. But there are many minorities discriminated against. Yazidis, Shiites in certain countries, Kurds, Turkomans. There is an awful lot of them, and some Sunni groups as well. Tolerance is for everyone.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes, Mr. Belder.
Thank you, Madam President. To talk about the situation of Christians in the Middle East raises above all the question of whether there is still a place and a future for Christians in the Arab world, or will the persecution and expulsion of people, which started with the Jews, continue now with the Christians in the 21st century. Islamic terrorism, which affects Christians in the Middle East, is also affecting the European continent, and only because of its own if only out of its own self-interest, the European Union should stand up for Christian and other minorities in the Middle East. It should give support for reform forces, support for reform of education as well, because what I'm hearing from experts is that totalitarianism based on Islamic beliefs is the worst of all governing systems. So I'd like the call on the EU to stand up for the future of the Christians in the Middle East, because it's very closely related to the future of Europe as well.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Kyuchyuk.
Благодаря, госпожо председател. Уважаема госпожо комисар.
Thank you very much, Madam President. High Representative, we are witness to the persecution of Christians in the Middle East. Radical groups in the Middle East are taking Christian women as slaves, as sex slaves, and Christian families are forced to leave their homes, leave their country, or lose their lives. Churches and other places of worship are destroyed. This is the situation that we have seen for the last couple of years. And that's why I'm calling upon the European Union to take the necessary measures to protect all religious minorities in the Middle East. I am convinced that tolerance and peaceful coexistence among all religions is key to the security and peace of the region.
Mr. Borghezio, 1.5 minutes.
President, the Vice President of the United States condemned ISIS, saying it was responsible for genocide against Christians, and he said that it's high time for the world to call it by its name. He quoted Trump, who talks about radical Islamist terrorists. So, my question, how come the other speakers, starting with the High Representative, don't even have the guts to call these perpetrators of genocide by their name? I do hope that in her response, if she forgot about it beforehand, the High Representative will correct that major error. We have to have the guts to call those people responsible for this genocide by their name. It's something which is happening before our very eyes. It's affecting our brothers in blood, also in religion. And this morning we welcomed a High Representative of the African Union. But 60% of the Christians dead are not in the Middle East, they're in Africa. But Assimi Meleki was here. No one actually thought to actually draw attention to that. We need more guts, members of the European Union.
Now, Mr. Adaktusson, for 1.5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, the terrorist attacks against the Coptic community in Egypt is part of an attempted genocide. In the words of ISIS stated a few weeks ago, Christians and their holy sites are legitimate targets in a war against infidels and tyrants. If this total contempt for human dignity does not end the discussion whether Christians can live under jihadi Salafism as long as they pay a penalty tax, I don't know if anything will. Because the threat against Christians in Egypt is fully in line with the barbaric acts of ISIS in other parts of the Middle East. Last February, a majority of this Parliament passed a resolution that defines the persecution of Christians in Iraq and Syria as genocide. This is of course important, but in view of the constant threats against Christians, it is imperative that further steps are taken. The Commission must act for a legally binding genocide recognition in the UN Security Council. Efforts for legal action against the perpetrators must be intensified. Respect for freedom of religion must be a top priority. Middle East governments, terrorist groups alike, should always know violation of the universal right to believe and worship will be punished. Justice will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Mizzi.
Signora President, Madam Mogherini, the situation of the Christians in the Middle East is of great concern. The Christian communities, which have long been established in the Middle East, are facing constantly increasing pressure. This is resulting in the great displacement of persons and people, and the decrease of Christians in the whole region. The explosions on Palm Sunday of 2 Coptic churches were just one attack on the Christians in the region. The aim is to increase tension in the region and hatred between the communities. The Christians were attacked because of their beliefs and their religion, and they have been attacked for tens of years, and they have ended up victims of terrorist groups and of authoritarian regime and of social discrimination, unemployment and poverty, and this only because they wish to practice their religion openly and freedom. This goes against the EU's values. We must defend pluralism in religion. The EU must be stronger. It must condemn any type of violence against persons and intolerance because of their beliefs. The next Foreign Affairs Council must address this question now and not later.
That was very.
And now 1.5 minutes, Mr. Škripek.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mrs. High Representative, colleagues, the situation of the Christians in the Middle East is alarming as we're speaking, many of us here, especially in Syria and Iraq. The Christians, as the indigenous people of the region, creating a much-needed balance between religion and ethnic groups, are expelled or killed or persecuted. With no Christians left, the European Union loses a reliable and perspective partner for reconstructing the Middle East. Mrs. High Representative, it should be our foremost priority to protect people who are cultural and civilizational-wise close to Europeans. We should support these groups both in humanitarian and political ways, but not only in Syria and Iraq, but also in the southern region of Turkey and other countries in the Middle East. It is a shame we let these atrocities happen, but thank you very much for the things you expressed in your statement at the beginning, the ways we support the minorities and the groups there. Another example is the Palestinian Authority. Churches under their authority are not able to register, even though they fulfill all requirements set by the law. The Palestinian Authority simply refused them. I have these examples, I can bring them. Mrs. High Representative, I call upon you to discuss these matters with the Palestinian authorities. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Madam Arnautu for 1.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame le Président. Massacre, assassinat.
Thank you, Madam President. Massacres, persecutions, humiliations, rapes, kidnappings, monasteries and churches destroyed, exodus, expulsions. The fate of the Christians in the Middle East is tragic, and their everyday life is extremely hard. Recently, Christians in Europe and the Middle East celebrated Easter, but the sound of those church bells has made itself sound ever more faint. If the EU simply continues its empty protests, then those church bells will fall silent. They are the victims of Islamist terrorists who want to cleanse the Middle East of the presence of Christians entirely. Some of the most ancient Christian communities in the world are now menaced with extinction, despite the fact that they have been in the region since before the Arab-Muslim conquests. These days, Christian communities represent just 3 to 4% of the population of the Middle East. There's only 11 million of them left, just a drop in the ocean of the surrounding 230 million Muslims. Through the bombs in Iran, Iraq and elsewhere, Europe has been at the cause of this radicalization. It doesn't help the Christians in the region to make the Russian and Syrian governments responsible for this, where the petro-monarchies of the Middle East are responsible?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Dear colleagues, what we are talking about today is not a question of the religiosity. The elimination of Christians from the Middle East is much more a human rights and security issue. The elimination of the Christians from the Middle East is much more. In Egypt, the Coptic community enjoys the great support from the President Sisi. Even so, it is extremely difficult to counter jihadism. In Iraq, however, the Christians will clearly disappear in a very short time. Even if ISIS is in defense, there is no guarantee for security at all. The EU does a lot of providing aid, but also individual member states have the homework. If the international community missed the opportunity to have the Christians return to their homes, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of families maybe decide to leave Iraq forever. EU financial support, including development and ECHO programs, are inaccessible for religious minorities and historical churches. A result, from affected communities are left out of the EU's humanitarian projects. Through activities of the AFET and DEVE, we must continue efforts to involve the faith-based organisations as partners in the European Union aid and reconstruction projects. European politicians, let's really wake up. We have been given a chance. We should use it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Liberadsky.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ms. Mogherini. You have my solidarity. It is a great thing that we are debating this. The European Union and Europe as such indeed has Christian roots, but at the same time we are a continent, we are a community that is highly tolerant, and we accept immigrants of various denominations, including Muslims. We allow them to practice their religion here, and we should expect the same from the states in the Middle East. I think that we should make all the necessary efforts to prevent de-Christianization of that region. And from that point of view, I'd like to support what Mr. Legutko has said. Lebanon is an example of a country where both Christians and Muslims coexist. Lebanon, at this moment, has almost the same number of immigrants as it does of regular citizens. Let's pay attention to this country, let's help it, and I think that the Christians in the Middle East have the right to expect help from us, and we are obliged to give it to them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And Mr. Vistisen for 1 minute.
Den kristne jødiske kulturarv i det her område.
The Judeo-Christian culture and heritage is thousands of years old, and it has marked the Middle East longer than the majority culture there now. It is a catastrophe that we are now seeing these conflicts in Syria and Iraq, which mean that the Christian minority is under a double pressure. First of all, the pressure of the conflict and the war, and secondly, they are under pressure because these minorities are particularly subject to religious persecution and expulsion. So we in the EU have a duty to protect the people who are suffering in this way, but particularly the Christians in refugee camps, or when the EU accepts refugees. It needs to be taken seriously, so we need to take action urgently if we want there to be a Christian community that survives in these countries.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes, Mr. Milan Mon.
Thank you, Madam President.
The Christian minorities are undergoing specific persecution in certain areas of the Middle East right now. Particularly serious is the activity of Daesh. Our resolution of February 2016 called the acts perpetrated by Daesh against these minorities genocide, and called on the international community to bring in the necessary measures to ensure that an international criminal court could establish the national penalties. Now, I haven't heard anyone calling this a genocide today. We have to continue to support these persecuted minorities, and that might mean welcoming them here or elsewhere where circumstances allow that. We have to allow these displaced and persecuted people, where it's possible, to go back home, as a lot of them would like to do. I welcome the announcement made by the Spanish Minister of Foreign Affairs yesterday that at the end of this month, the second international conference on victims of ethnic and religious violence in the Middle East is going to be held, where some of these issues are going to be addressed. That hasn't been mentioned today by you either. Now, persecution of religious minorities, Christians in particular, makes no sense, not from a religious point of view either. And I'm also going to quote Pope Francis during his recent visit to Egypt. He talked about the only extremism which is being allowed being charity. And I will close by saying that Christianity is very much linked to the EU. So what we can't allow right now is that from the EU we fail our Christians. Thank you.
Madam Gomez, 1 minute, please.
O colega Milano, seria bom que os líderes europeus que se dizem cristãos ouvissem e tirassem.
Thank you. European leaders must do something and draw lessons from Pope Francis's message. They must draw the right political and religious implications and look at protecting Coptic Christians against extremist violence. This week in Fatima, the Pope reminded us of the importance of dialogue with Muslims and those of other faiths. We are duty-bound to understand that respect for and defence of religious minorities can only be guaranteed in the Middle East when Europe stands as guarantor for freedom of such religious minorities, so that they feel safe to return home to their regions of origin. It is vitally important that we support them and support such areas of freedom. It is important that in this regard we also fight against Islamophobia and root out populist tendencies in Europe. Otherwise, we will not get a handle on the terrorist threat.
Blue cards because of our time constraints, and that was already announced by the previous chair. And I now move to Mr. KRASNODÄBSKI for 1 minute, please.
Dziękuję bardzo, Pani Przewodnicząca.
Thank you very much, Madam President. According to the Open Doors data, in 2016 we could speak about the worst year for the past 25 years as far as persecution of Christians is concerned. 4 in 5 people killed for their religion are Christians. 10 countries which have the problem of the worst persecution is 9 of them are Islamic, are Muslim states. That means we have to do with systemic ethnic and religious cleansing and genocides. But the post-Christian West and post-Christian Europe doesn't deal with this subject efficiently. Especially Western politicians do not point at Christians as the victims. They prefer to speak, like Madame Mogherini, about diversity, about freedom of religion and tolerance. So also the Parliament, who talks a lot about Muslim immigrants in Europe, doesn't really want to deal with these subjects. It's enough to recall the today morning's debate. We also cannot ignore the fact that Christians sometimes in Europe are also facing discrimination.
Mr. KELAM, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President.
we must be very much aware of the fact that Christians in the Middle East often have most suffered from internal conflicts, while they have usually not been part of it. On the contrary, they have rather had a mediating and reconciliating role. So they have been caught in a way between a rock and a hard place. One of my visitors from Erbil told me that the EU needs to have an honest debate whether the international community really wants Christians to survive in the region from where Christianity has emerged. If Christians were not humans, they would have been defined long ago as an endangered species and taken under international protection. But now their numbers are decreasing in dramatic speed. We heard about the phrase of de-Christianization of the Middle East. And probably Christians will not survive another major conflict in the area. The question is whether there will be any Christians in liberated Mosul or ever living in Nineveh Plains. And two proposals to the Commissions. The EU and international organizations cannot provide directly aid to religion-based groups. We need to change the rules because churches can provide most direct help to the people in real need. And second, the EU can make a difference. As a large provider of humanitarian aid, our red line should be to set criteria on local authorities that humanitarian aid must reach all groups and minorities without discriminations, that Christians and other minority religions will be guaranteed return to their homes and equal rights. Thank you.
Mr. Turkish, 1.5 minutes.
Elnök asszony!
Madam President, there was a bloody attack on the Coptic Christian community, and André Boulard, the father of the community, spoke out against it, but he was not the only one. He was also turning to the Democratic West, accusing the Democratic West of creating this concept of Islamophobia together with those forces, and it is a lie because it is simply meant to silence people. Also, he spoke out against those who talk about multiculturalism and openness and the way in which they have in fact contributed to the destruction of a civilization, a very precious and valuable civilization. I would like to welcome the fact that the European Parliament is having a debate today regarding Christians in the Middle East. Look at what has happened to our Christian brothers in Syria and elsewhere. We have an obligation towards them. We must never forget them. We must never let them suffer this fate, because after all, this is a manifestation of our very culture. And similarly, the Union and the EEAS need to stand up for these principles. We need to speak out against cleansing based on religions, based on faith, the way in which the members of the Christian community are being victimized by the hundreds of thousands. And therefore I would like to give thanks to all of you on behalf of Open Doors, an organization that looks out for Christians around the world, and I would also like to thank the EPP for this initiative. And of course I would like to thank the office that has been set up specifically by the government in Hungary to protect this community. Thank you.
Mrs. Andriukaitis, for 1.5 minutes, please.
Madam Mogherini, colleagues, according to reports, persecution of Christians has risen worldwide for 3 years in a row. In total, more than 200 million Christians live in countries where they are subject to hostilities, ranging from constant pressure, social discrimination and harassment, to physical violence, imprisonment and even death. Christians are now killed in more countries than ever before and are persecuted in more countries than any other religious group. For those of us who have been following the story of Christian persecution, this news does not come as a surprise. Instead, it serves as a sad confirmation of what we have been witnessing over the past few years.
In the Middle East, Christians are killed countless. Their homes and churches are destroyed. Their crosses torn down and smashed. Bibles burned to ashes. But the worst stories are these of decapitations, mass executions, and torture. We must ask ourselves, how long will we allow Christians to be the most persecuted people in the world? Until there are none left in the Middle East? Until they are wiped out in other parts of the world? It's time to act. We, the EU, must come to the aid of those who are suffering persecutions because of their Christian faith. And we can certainly do more. I urge you, Madam High Representative, to have the issue of persecution of Christians high on your agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Christoforou.
Thank you, Madam President. There can be no doubt that the situation in the Middle East is nightmarish. In the cradle of Christianity, where it all began, where the most ancient Christian communities live, there is a murderous campaign being waged against them. And when we talk about the destruction of Christianity in the Middle East, we've got to speak clear language and say that this is a real genocide of Christians. And High Representative Mogherini, we here in the European Parliament, when we talk to Christians in the Middle East, and if they say to us, what are we doing to stop them from being destroyed, we have to have a reply. Because there are only 5 million now. This is a real vital threat to the Christian community there, but also in Cyprus, where we're facing an occupation, a force of occupation. And the champion in this area of Christian genocide has been the Turks with the Pontic Greeks and the Armenians. That was an attempt to destroy Christian culture and the Christian community. And Mrs. Mogherini, with all the respect I bring to your post, Mr. Çelik, who you met with, when it said that countries such as Turkey cannot continue to persecute, to terrorize Greeks in Cyprus, Christians in the Middle East, now to terrorize Greece, and to terrorize the occupied territories where those vestiges and monuments still are. I think that if you're talking to Mr. Çelik, then just ask him what has happened to all of the vestiges which have been removed and stolen by Turkey. That, I think, is another dimension to this tragedy. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Marias. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I called it wrong because I was looking at the wrong...
Don't worry.
Madam Matthias.
Don't worry, I understood.
It does matter, actually. Thank you.
Yes,
you have
gender matters, but it doesn't matter the mistake.
Thank you.
In any case. Obrigada, Sra. Presidente, Sra. Mogherini.
Thank you, Madam President. Mrs. Mogherini, I agree with your message of hope for all faiths, your hopes for their future where they face the ravages of terrorism. I would also agree with your message to Eastern Christians, Coptic Christians, and indeed all faiths that suffer persecution. We should remember one thing: we are all part of a community, and Egyptians should come together. I was quite taken aback by something I heard here in this chamber, that we should save Christians first, that the murder of Christians somehow counts double. That surely is a return to the days of the Crusades. We should all stand together, shoulder to shoulder, in the fight against terrorism. Millions of Christians suffer in the Middle East, but also millions of Muslims are suffering and dying in the Middle East, and we should stand shoulder to shoulder with all faiths.
Thank you. Colleagues, we have over 15 speakers for Catch the Eye, so I'm going to be a very unpopular chair, but I will do my best. I'm going to give it to 8 speakers. And I would ask you to observe the time. I will cut you off if you go over. So the first speaker is Madam Šulin.
Hvala za besedo, predsedujoča. Napadi na kristjane in cerkve na
Thank you very much, Madam President. Thank you for giving me the floor. These attacks on Christian churches and Christians in the Middle East are not acceptable. We must therefore speak out against these attacks and we must resist these attacks. We have been witnessing attacks targeting Christians in the Middle East. We've been witnessing this for many years now. We're talking about ancient civilizations in Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria. This intolerance shown towards Christians is something that is more and more manifest in the European Union as well. People who have a faith, including Christians, are very often the victims of discrimination. We have 90,000 Christians who have already lost their lives, and Christians are in fact amongst those that are the most severely persecuted around the world. The role of the European Union should be to be present.
Microphone, please.
Grazie, Presidente. Il mondo...
Thank you, Madam President. The Western world seems to be becoming accustomed to the persecution of Christians in the Middle East, as if this were some inevitable tragedy one had simply to accept. Christian communities have been hard pressed by decades of war, poverty, instability, political persecution. But the problem is not something which is there preserved. It's not just them. As Pope Francis said, so many innocent people are hard pressed, Christians, Muslims, and those belonging to minorities such as the Yazidis. It's a long-term thing. It has to do with religious intolerance, which doesn't distinguish between faiths and credos when fundamentalism is in the air. We must move towards reconciliation, to a future of respect, trust and peace, the opposite of war. But it's not sufficient for us to condemn. As we're doing that, we must assume the responsibility and to break the veil of resignation, which is such a danger to us and citizens worldwide, because we share a responsibility for those Christians. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Christians are one of the most endangered communities in the Middle East. The systematic expulsions, burning down of churches, terrorist attacks on Christian communities, all these events have been taking place before our eyes for years. We keep drawing attention to this, we keep discussing this, but the safety of Christians in the Middle East always ends up far behind our priorities and our particular interests. I believe we finally have to face the fact that the situation of Christians in the Middle East is far worse than it was before the Arab Spring and the wars in Iraq and Syria. I believe we should fight for our interests, but in doing so we must take care not to cause chaos in entire regions throughout the world, because Middle Eastern Christians are one of the collateral victims of such chaos.
Thank you, Madam President. We have been following very closely the debate about the damage being done to Christian communities. This surely must be anathema to any sense of globalization. I'm afraid that our lamentations are not a response, because we should be doing what we should have done long ago. I think I'm the first person who said that the Arab Spring was going to turn into an Arab winter, a cold Arab winter, but no one listened to me when I said that. But events are not waiting. They're not standing still. Because we must look at who started the war and is responsible for its continuation. I'm afraid that tears are not enough.
Thank you. Madam Šojdrová.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, I firmly believe that the High Representative will call for better help for Christians, and in is hearing our call for such assistance to be provided. These Christians are at home in the Middle East. They don't want to be driven out of their homes and murdered. They have been living in this region for over 2,000 years. They are a peaceful, highly cultivated group of people. What can we do? In 2015, the alarm bells were sounded and we were asked to assist these people. Some Iraqi Christians were given refugee status, but it was a drop in the ocean. Now we've heard very tangible proposals today, and I would ask Mrs. Mogherini to put such tangible proposals into action, provide support to Christians in the Middle East, help these people to stay at home.
Mavrides.
Thank you, President. In front of our eyes, we're seeing the Holocaust of Christians in the Middle East, where Christianity was born. And without going into a long analysis, that cannot be allowed to disappear just because Islamic State is there. With the destruction of churches and Christian vestiges, our hopes and prayers must be with Christians everywhere, but also with those who are not Christians in the Middle East, but in particular the Orthodox, the Catholics, the Copts, and all the other ones. Mrs. Mogherini, I'm going to say this slowly so that it's well translated. Can I bring to you publicly a call, an appeal from 2 Orthodox metropolitans who were abducted 3 years ago by the Haleppi, that's Metropolitan Pavlos and Metropolitan Johanna, because Pino wants to know what happened to them and what fate befell them.
1 minute.
Me? Sorry. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think it's very good that we're having this debate, number one, because for too long we have seen the destruction, the execution, the destroying of the Christian heritage and people in the Middle East. And we are really the only ones they can turn to. And especially it's important that we send out a message to our fellow Christian brothers and sisters that the European Union is going to stand behind them. I was very encouraged by the words of the High Representative Mogherini, and I think that's very important to them psychologically, but also in a practical sense. The fact that 4 out of 5 people killed because of their religion are Christians tells its own tale, and we have a powerful role to play, especially in terms of humanitarian aid, development aid, etc. It should be conditional that religious tolerance will be practiced in these areas, and especially that there will be due regard for Christians, because we in Europe are mainly Christian and we are going to stand in the Middle East.
Mr. Marias.
Thank you, President. The situation of Christians in the Middle East is nightmarish, as we saw recently with the attacks by jihadis against Coptic churches in Egypt. They're destroying Christian communities in Syria and elsewhere in a kind of religious cleansing. The persecution is systematic and programmatic, deliberate. It's a kind of a new version of ethnic cleansing. And we have a responsibility to come to the defense of Christian communities and take measures so that they can return to their homes in safety. But let's not forget that Saudi Arabia allows mosques to function in Europe at a time when Christian churches are not able to function, to operate on Saudi territory, and in particular in Mecca. We have to be more decisive, more robust in order to prevent this literal Holocaust of Christians. Thank you very much.
Madam Zaborska.
Representative,
if I just wanted to name the terrorist attacks and read the names of the innocent victims murdered by Islamist militants just because they were baptized and went to church, I would not have enough time. The states in which these murders are committed have received billions of euros of humanitarian and development aid in the past 10 years. The recent attack at the Coptic Christians in Egypt proves that the situation of Christians has remained equally desperate since the Archbishop Araho in Mosul was murdered in 2008. Our support, development support, did not bring any change. Our help to Christians did not help. They are still being murdered, intimidated, kidnapped, and their fundamental rights are being denied on a daily basis. With all due respect to Mrs. Mogherini, I think that the EU's external activities are failing here, and I would like to ask for rectification of this situation.
This is our Catch the Eye, and I now give the floor to Vice President Mogherini. Thank you.
Grazie, Presidente. Normalmente in quest'Aula.
Thank you, President. I usually speak English in the chamber, but today, might I, in concluding this important debate which has taken place this evening, this is perhaps an opportunity to speak in my own language, one of the great languages of the Christian world. Latin is not available translation-wise, so I'll confine myself to Italian. Now, anyone who comes from Rome or not far from the Vatican will understand just how important this is for me and all of us. And you'll no doubt understand the devotion that I bring to work in this area. I'd like to focus on 3 points at the end of this debate. First of all, the European Union has and maintains human rights at the very centre of its foreign policy. And that's not true for everyone at this particular time, but for us, this is a beacon for our action worldwide. Secondly, for us, freedom of worship and religion is a fundamental right which must be guaranteed, upheld and promoted for all religions and in all areas of the world. The Christians in the Middle East, but also Christians elsewhere in the world, as members have reminded us, Christians are being attacked in other parts of the world, and that's just as worrying. But let's also bear in mind, as colleagues have said, that it's necessary to protect all communities and all creeds and religions, even in Europe as well. And I would support those who have reminded us of the need to prevent and oppose xenophobia in Europe, and Pope Francis has reminded us that it's incumbent on Europe to rediscover its ability to integrate and to bring in and to remember that there are other roots in Europe apart from our Christian heritage, and respect, tolerance, mutual protection are all vital. The third dimension is that this is not just a human rights issue. Christians in the Middle East, it's not just a matter of tolerance. It's also, first and foremost, a question of preserving diversity in a region, of cultures and history as well. Now, from that point of view, I would agree with my colleagues who have made this point around the room. It's a political issue, but it's a security issue also, because the disappearance of Christian communities in the Middle East would bring about a change to the very nature of society in the Middle East, and this would be a very dangerous drift. And for this reason, the EU works every day with the instruments in our panoply to protect the rights of Christians in the Middle East, to protect the rights of everyone to profess their own religion in any part of the world. And I repeat, in conclusion, my thanks to Parliament for this debate. Many member states are promoting initiatives in this direction. Spanish colleagues were reminding us of the conference in Madrid next week, which is very important, and only recently the Spanish foreign minister talked about that, and that's important, that we should be united and that we should unite around shared principles which we all cleave to, which we all must uphold. We must bring all the reserve and the resolve and rationality to bear on these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Mogherini. Thank you. Colleagues, the debate is closed and we will have a brief moment for a switch of commissioners, so bear with me. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. We will now move to the next item on our agenda, which is a statement by the Vice President. Just bear with me one moment. Thank you. Mr. Stylianides will speak on behalf of the Commission on the issue of the Dadaab refugee camp. So I now give the floor to Commissioner Stylianides. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, honourable members of the European Parliament, thank you for this timely initiative to discuss the Dadaab refugee camp situation. You know the facts. In May 2016, the Kenyan government announced its decision to proceed with the rapid closure of the camp, citing security concerns and the need to end